if you have your scriptures or if you're nearby the scriptures, then I invite you to find in the New Testament, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25. I'm going to talk to you first about the word of the day, and the word of the day is aspect. How many know the word aspect? How many have heard the word aspect? You know, I was drawn to that for some reason, and it was kind of playing through my mind. And in the more general sense, aspect just means a part or a particular piece of something. But when you really dig into what aspect means, it tends to mean, originally it meant a view of something that was presented. So what that would be is the building had a southern aspect to it, meaning that it presented that view to it. Okay? You follow me? But aspect can also mean the view that someone chooses to take of something. So it can either be the view that's presented by something or a view that someone chooses to take. So maybe the building had a southern aspect to it, but I decided I'd kind of take a western aspect to it. Like I know what either of those things mean. I don't know what west or south means, but that's just, some stuff that we do. But the word aspect itself can mean either a view that's presented or it can mean a view that we choose to take. I've thought about that because in parables, there is an aspect of parables that is kind of like, here's the primary view that is presented by the parable. But there are sometimes other aspects to it, which is there are other views that we can choose to take, that we can sometimes get some other kinds of insight and learn some things by taking a little bit different aspect to it. You tracking me? Or have I lost you? Okay. Clear as mud? Thank you. Please tell me you're joking because I don't want to have to go back and say all that stuff again. Okay? There is a particular view that gets presented about things, but there is also then a view that we can choose to take of those things. Let me give you some for instances. A couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the parable in Matthew chapter 20 about the laborers. Remember, some were hired early in the morning, and then some through the day, and some at the last hour, 11th hour, which was 5 o'clock, but nonetheless. Now, if we could look at that as the aspect of the first laborers who were hired, and if we look at it in that aspect, there's some interesting things that can come up. But if we look at it from the aspect of some of the later workers hired, we'll see some very different things. And if we look at it from the aspect of the landowner, we see another view of things. Last week we talked about the 10 girls, right? And the bridegroom and the whole processional that was going to happen. And there were 5 that were wise and 5 that were not so wise, right? Now, we could look at that parable from the aspect of the 5 who were wise. We could also look at it from the 5 who were foolish. Or we could look at it from the aspect of the groom. All right. Hey, wait, who's here? I'm joking. In Matthew 25, beginning at verse 14, we have another parable that Jesus tells. And this parable is another parable about the kingdom. And with it comes some aspect. Let's take a look. Matthew chapter 25, we're going to begin at verse 14. For it, that is the kingdom, for the kingdom is like a man who is about to go on a journey. He called his slaves, he entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1 talent, each according to his ability, and then the man went on his journey. Immediately, straightway, the one who had received the 5 talents went, traded with them, and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received 2 talents gained 2 more. But the one who received the 1 talent went away. He dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. And the one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents. He said, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I've gained 5 more. And his master said, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted to me 2 talents. See, I've gained 2 more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had received 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you scattered no seed, and I was afraid, and went away, and I hid your talent in the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said, You wicked, lazy slave. You said that you knew that I reap where I did not sow, gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank. And on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore, take away the talent from him. Give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has shall more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have will be taken away. Cast out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place where there will be weeping, gnashing of teeth. Would you bow with me and we'll pray? Now, Father, I want to say that I know that you love me. And I want to tell you that I love you too. And I know too that you love these people here today. And I want to tell you that I love them too. Pray you would speak and we would hear. In Jesus' name, amen. Aspect. There's about 4 that I could count types of aspect that we could bring to this passage. Right? There's the aspect of the one who received 5 talents. That would be a very interesting aspect. Or the one who received 2. He's the middle child. Right? Or the one who received 1. Or the master. The perspective of the master. And I thought what we would probably do today is we'd come at this from the aspect of the master. Because when we come at it and we read it from that aspect, if you will, there are certain things that kind of start to really emerge and show forth for us as far as in the parable. Here's the first thing. The master in this story is a master of unfathomable wealth. We don't run the same monetary system that they did in the New Testament. So let's break it down. Instead of pennies and quarters and dollars and Benjamins, right? Instead of those, you had what they would call a denarius, and you'd have a talent, and those things don't mean a whole lot to me as I read it. Anybody else? They're just kind of words. I don't know really what they mean. So let's dig in a little bit. Back when we looked at Matthew 20 and the story of the laborers, the master in Matthew 20 engages the laborers and he says, I will give you a denarius for your labor. That was the going rate. A denarius was 1 day's wage, the going rate. In Matthew 25, the master, it says, gives each of the slaves a talent. A talent was the equivalent of 6,000 denarius. Pretty big sum of money if you think about it. 6,000 days' wages. Anyone doing the math on that? How many years' wages is that? Come on, you math majors. I'm joking. Somewhere around 17, with some generous bonuses thrown in. 17 years' worth of wages. 1 talent. But the guy on the low end got 1. Someone doubled that, so that's 12,000 days of wages. And the first guy got 5, which is, what is that, 30,000? All told, the master gives out 8 talents times 6, 48,000 days worth of wages. That's an awful lot of money. But we know he was going on a journey, so it was going to cost him to be away on the journey. We also have no idea what was held back, just in case, because. All we know is that this is an unfathomable amount of money or wealth that the master has. Agreed? Our toes can't touch the bottom in this pool. But we need to add something. Beyond crunching the numbers, we have to understand an underlying thread in the New Testament, and here it is. An underlying thread that runs through the New Testament is this. Material wealth is an image. There's some substance to material wealth, obviously, but largely in the New Testament, it's an image only of the true wealth. Now listen, the true wealth is wealth of spirit. And any thinking person knows this. The true wealth isn't measured in stuff. It's measured in spirit. Because when you really look at it, by and large in life, what would generate the stuff is spirit. Paul tells Timothy, he says, you need to instruct folks who have a lot of things to be generous. Because when they're generous, they will find life indeed. They will find a truer kind of wealth. The truest wealth is wealth of spirit. You know what that is, don't you? You know what that looks like? Wealth of spirit, right? Wealth of spirit is the capacity to love. Wealth of spirit is deep joy. Wealth of spirit is real peace. It's the ability to be patient and kind, gentle and faithful, to control ourselves. That's the truest wealth. And the master has unfathomable wealth. Remember, it's in John chapter 4. Jesus has a conversation with the lady at the well. How many remember this story? Woman at the well. Remember? And suddenly it turns to worship. And he explains something really important to her. He explains how God is. Remember what he says? God is spirit. Listen, the truest wealth is the wealth of spirit. Let me tell you a story. If you've heard this story, don't stop me because I like telling it. When we were serving a church in Michigan, I would get together with different folks at different times, just check-in lunches, or sometimes just to be able to pour into some folks. And I got together with a couple of people, all kind of across the spectrum. And occasionally I would get together with Dr. Bob, and Dr. Bob was an ophthalmic surgeon. And Dr. Bob had a lot of stuff. And then we would get together for lunch, and I don't know why I was treating, because he would get together for lunch, and he would say, well, I wasn't really sure whether to bring the Tahoe or the Lexus today. It's like, really? Tough. The kind of stuff you have to deal with is tough. He and his family moved out of their 4,000 square foot home because it wasn't big enough to be able to build and move into an 8,000 square foot home, but they still did keep the cottage on the lake that was only 2,500 square feet. And I'm buying an Applebee's. And Bob's marriage was almost always in crisis. He had 4 sons who really couldn't stand their dad. And by his own means of dealing with people, he had very few friends. And those who were his friends were probably more his friends because of his stuff. That's Dr. Bob. But then there was Greg. Let me tell you about Greg. Greg had some mental health issues. Okay, he was paranoid schizophrenic. And he struggled, and he was so happy when he'd gotten his own apartment. And he had been able to buy for himself a used, what is it, S10? Are those the little pickups? Is that right, S10s? Anyone? I'm not a truck person. Is that right, S10? Okay. He got himself an S10 pickup. And he always wanted to pick me up to take me to lunch. And which was okay, but Greg smoked a lot. And so you kind of do the whole, hey, how about I drive, Greg? No, I want you to ride in my S10 pickup. And so I did. And I'd always do the same thing. I'd wait for him to get in. Then I'd come to the door. I'd take a deep breath. And then I'd get in and I'd hold my breath like that. And I thought, you know what? Half the folks here probably in the church, if I ever had lunch with Greg, they probably thought I was changed. Okay, but nonetheless. But we would go, and he liked to go to Bob Evans. So we went to Bob Evans, and we were sitting there, and he told me once, he said, you know, that's the way he did. Barney, yeah, Greg, you and me, we're a lot alike. And I wanted to say, well, which one of you, Greg? No, I didn't. And then he told me, he said, you know, I've got it good. I got my own place. I don't have to sleep on the street. And I've got my own truck. And I can go where I want. My life is pretty good. Who was rich? Greg or Dr. Bob? One had a lot of stuff, and the other, with all his struggle, had a wealth of spirit, and that's the true wealth. And in this parable, the master is the master of unfathomable wealth. And the talk of talent and money is an image of something far deeper, which is the kind of life that God lives. It is a life of outrageous love, of an untold depth of joy, of incredible peace. That's the wealth that he has. Isn't that something? And that's the first part that we see about the master and that aspect of the parable. Here's the next one. The master is the master of investment. Right? The one who has unspeakable, unfathomable wealth is a master of investment. We're told 3 verbs that are brought to bear as far as the master and his slaves. Here they are. He called them. He entrusted his possessions to them. And then it said he gave. That's the path of some investment. But what I really want to do is focus in on the middle one. He entrusted his possessions to the slaves. His wealth he entrusts to his servants. Who heard of such a thing? Years ago, I was at a conference, and one of the speakers there was Leith Anderson. That may or may not mean anything to you, but sometimes I remember stuff. And I remembered this for probably 20-some years. Because I was at this conference, and Leith Anderson was speaking, and he shared about the whole idea about trusting in God. And he said, you know, we hear about this, the importance as far as to trust in God. And he said, I wouldn't argue that. And sometimes the big question that people have is, can I trust God? And he said, and I don't argue with that. I understand that. He said, but there's an equal question, a question of equal value, and here it is. Can God trust you? He said, we don't seem to hear very much about whether God could trust you. He said, I don't seem to ask myself very often, can God trust me? But that's exactly what this parable is about, right? God trusts his things to people. And I thought, well, what are the things, the possessions? What does he trust to us? Here's what I think. I think he trusts his grace to us. So that it won't be just that he shows grace to us, but he trusts grace to us so that we would show grace to somebody else. Does that make sense? Ooh. When I was thinking through that, another story came to mind, and it's not a very pretty one, and it's a story about me. Years ago, I worked with a not-for-profit, health-related organization that was volunteer intensive. The American Cancer Society. And I was an area director. And as I began, they had kind of a gathering of the different area directors come together and kind of get things rolling and have some sort of area meeting. And in that meeting, I met a young lady. We'll call her Janine. And I had kind of one of these foreign kinds of experiences for me. Because basically, I'm one that I think I kind of am just ready to like whoever I meet. I think so. But there was something in the air. Some sort of a reverse chemistry. And I met Janine. And it was like automatic. I did not like her. And it was like, this isn't really comfortable, but I didn't like her. In fact, in my mind, I gave her a new name. I left her first name the same, but her last name was not Whittle, but I nicknamed her in my own mind Whittle. And Whittle, W-I-D-L, in my mind stood for who I don't like. It was immediate, it was intense. But you know what happened? At almost every gathering that we had, I can't compete. No. At almost every gathering we had, I kind of fed that I didn't like her. Does that make sense? Anytime there was a gathering, I would see her, oh yeah, I don't really like her. And I nursed that along. Sometimes I was never rude. My mom raised me better than that, but you still could find ways to signal, I don't really like you. And I did that time and time again. And I fed that in me. Do you know what that does to the soul? To feed a dislike of someone? I don't know if you've ever found yourself in that or not. I don't know if you've ever gone down that road, but I went down that road and it was not pretty. And somewhere it hit me very hard. Wait a minute. In view of the grace that God showed me, this is what I'm doing? And I will add this. I do see things. I do observe things. And when I do see those dynamics going on or coming from people to other people, it does cross my mind. Do you even know what you're doing to your soul? Do you even understand the undercut to grace? The grace given you that you can't seem to bring yourself to give to someone else. God's trusted you with His possessions and His treasure. And one part of that treasure is His grace that He's given to me and to you. And part of the trust in that is simply this, that we would in some measure show the grace to somebody else that He showed to us. That's what He trusts. Can He trust you? And if so, good. And if not, why can't He trust you with something like that? I can go on. I can go on and on. He's trusted you with goodness. He's trusted me with goodness. And I live in that goodness. Goodness of family, goodness of shelter, goodness of things, goodness of material means. And He's trusted that to me. And He's shared it with me. And surely, in the name of Jesus, if He shared that with me, maybe, just maybe, I could share it with somebody else. He's trusted that to me. And there's more. He's trusted me with some gifts. I didn't earn them. He just gave them. And He's given you gifts. And He's blessed us by giving us those gifts. Why? So that maybe we could use them to lift somebody else. maybe we could use it to make a life better. God's trusted. This is the investment. The master is a master of the great investment. And he is invested in you. And he is invested in me. Look at this story. There is no slave in the story that isn't invested in. Right? So, something else we find about the master. Unfathomable wealth. And he's also the master of investment. There's a third part to the story. And here it is. In this parable, the master is the master of the settled account. The settled account. In the parable, there are three things that are for certain. The master who left on the journey will return. That's clear. Agreed? And though his return is delayed, the return is never in doubt. The master who departed will return. That's clear. Here's the second. The master who invested will settle the account upon his return. And that's certain. I don't know if you know this, but there are some accountings that go on in our church every year. Did you know that? It usually starts in the fall. Mid-fall, there is an accounting that goes on. I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot, but I'm going to put Mel on the spot because in the fall, every year, we sit down and we evaluate. We evaluate what's been done, what needs to be done. We evaluate her role and her responsibility and her performance. One-on-one. And then at the bottom, we sign and we date it. We sat down and we talked the whole thing through. Do you all know that? What you may or may not know is that a little bit later from that, I bring that evaluation to the leadership team and they all review that point of accounting. Oh, but it doesn't stop there. Because then 7 people who are on the leadership team evaluate me. Because it's very, very important that I have someone or someones to answer to. So they have a framework and they start evaluating me personally, professionally, how I perform, my presence in the church and the community. And then they get that to Gary, who then gets it to me, and everyone on the board evaluates me. And then, in January, when we have our annual meeting, you all are given the means to evaluate our church leadership. You all know this. And those things are reviewed, and we walk through it. We all need to answer to someone. Here in Matthew 25, the master is the master of the settled account. That's sure. And out of the settling of that account, there's 2 possibilities. One is great joy, and the other is despair. That's the way the story plays out, right? Think about this. The guy who got 5 and doubled it to 10. Remember, that's 5, 30,000 denarii, right? Doubled. 60,000 days' wages. And remember what the master says to him? You were faithful in a little. That's a little. You will be trusted with much more. I have no idea what the master has in mind with that, but that must bring great joy. And what the implications are when the master returns, that he would invite us to something even more. I don't know what that is, but that's what it says. But to the one who had an argument about God with the master about how he was, right? He lost even what he had, which is despair. It leads to despair. So, here's the other thing that's certain. The outcome of joy or the outcome of despair depends on your decision. That's the only determining factor that I can see in the parable. They made a decision about what they will do with what they were given. And the decision they made determined the outcome. Isn't that the way it plays? They decided they would do something. They decided they would try. And because they decided they would do something, because they decided they would try in regard to the possessions that were given to them, that leads to great joy. But those who decide, no, I'm too afraid to try, that decision leads to despair. That's the way the story plays out. And you know what determines the outcome? Their decision. That's the way it reads. The master in Matthew 25, 14 to 30 has unspeakable wealth. And he is a master who invests in people. But he is the master of the settled account. And everyone who is given settles the account. And that's the parable. Here are some takeaway points for you, okay? Then we'll be done. The treasure here that's received also brings responsibility. Right? We love the idea of receiving the treasure, but with the treasure received comes some responsibility. There's your takeaway point. Here's another one. Entrusting to us brings expectation for us. Right? The master entrusted his possessions, and at the end, there was an expectation in regard to what we do with it. Takeaway point. To be entrusted with something brings expectations. Here's the last one. The grace that leads to our transformation, that changes our life, also should lead us to be willing to try. Sounds about right. The grace that would transform us would also lead us to try. What responsibility have you received by receiving the treasure? What expectation might God have by entrusting things to you? What kind of things should you be willing to try with the grace that's begun to change you? Those are good things to think about and to pray about. And I'll leave that with you.